Hello, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching News in Depth. Ukraine wants to produce some 800 interceptor drones daily to prevent Russia from damaging the country's critical infrastructure. But Kiev does not only defend itself, it also attacks Russia with homemade long-range drones and missiles deep behind the enemy lines. And what has Europe learned from the long lesson of aerial warfare in Ukraine? To talk about it, we're joined by our very own Ukraine correspondent, EU correspondent, Alex Cadier. Good to have you here, Alex. So, at first it's very much seemed that it would be like the war of tanks, right? Something we know from the Second World War. But now we know it has changed dramatically. It's the war of drones. So, how has Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, changed our idea of modern warfare?
Well, you're right to describe it as several different types of war. We remember the very start of the full-scale invasion, February 2022, those columns of Russian tanks going down the roads in what seemed like quite a traditional, if not old-school version of war. Now, that obviously did not work out very well for that initial Russian invasion, which was eventually pushed back. That then shifted into some kind of war of attrition. Not World War II, but more like World War I. Trenches, artillery, very old-fashioned fighting when it comes to both sides. That's when the priority from the Ukrainian side became all about munitions and having more artillery, having HIMARS from the United States, those long-range artilleries. We, particularly covering this in Brussels and in Kiev, the number we heard over and over again was 155 millimeters. They wanted those 155 shells, as many as they could. We saw the Czech initiative to try and pool purchases and ramp up production in Europe. But you're absolutely right. The war as it stands now, as we've been covering it for TVP World, is completely different than it was at the start. It's different to what we've seen before. It's certainly different to any war we've seen in Europe. There are a few factors, a few key factors. Drones, of course, are the big factor. Two main types, FPV drones, first-person view. Those are piloted almost like a video game. The operator...
So those are the suicide drones?
Absolutely. They're suicide drones, but you can also have reconnaissance drones. So they are surveilling the battlefield, informing other drone battalions on where to strike. Some of them also have the capability now of dropping munitions, dropping bombs or dropping landmines. So they really are quite versatile, those FPV drones. And they are...
That was the initial use of drones, if I'm not mistaken, right? Just like, you know, civilian drones dropping grenades, right?
Absolutely. The initial use is what drones were used for in civilian use. So they had a camera, they were able to fly very steadily. So in a war perspective, that allows you to have surveillance of the battlefield for very cheap. This is crucially what the FPV drones were a big difference. When I was reporting in Kiev, I went to these volunteer groups just in their basements on the weekends, putting FPV drones together in direct contact with military units who said, well, actually, we need this kind of radio signal from it. We need this kind of camera. This doesn't work. Constantly evolving. That's another aspect to this war. The full country response, as they call it. Ukrainian civilians either fundraising. I met a man who builds decoys, so fake artillery made of wood. Costs about $1,500 to build them. The Russian side has spent in one go $100,000 to destroy it, right? So all these things, a lot of fundraising happening in Ukraine, a lot of volunteers doing evacuations, a lot of technological advances, but also not the traditional sending the army to fight. In Ukraine, the whole country is fighting.
Now, Alex, it is indeed the war of drones. And Ukraine seems now to focus on targets deep behind the enemy lines, mainly on oil refineries. According to the Ukrainian government, some 27% of Russia's oil capacity in this field has been disabled. Now, how to explain, you know, the high accuracy of these attacks? Because it seems that they hit exactly when they need to do it.
And they hit on very complicated systems.
Yes.
If you and I tried to figure out which part of an oil refinery to hit to be effective, I don't think we'd do particularly well. Let's bring it back to those drones themselves. And that's the other aspect of what we were just talking about. They are cheap, they are mass-produced, and so they can swarm. This is one of the aspects of these attacks, both on the Russian side with Shahed drones, cheap Iranian designed drones, and with those Ukraine-made drones on the other side, is that because you can mass produce them, you can send a lot at the same time and overwhelm air defenses. So that's the first aspect. That's why they get through in the first place. Now, when it comes to your question about accuracy, we've seen reports and we've known from our sources in Ukraine that Western intelligence is helping a lot when it comes to targeting. US intelligence, shared by the Trump administration, of course, which has been seen as perhaps lukewarm in support for Ukraine, but this has been a help, at least from the Ukrainian perspective, to be able to target the specific storage part or the specific pipeline or the specific pit of these huge oil refineries.
Which makes me wonder whether it was indeed Kyiv's initiative or Washington's.
Well, clearly the initiative and the production of these drones and the desire to hit deep into Russian territory has been Ukrainian for a long time. If we look at the spring of 2024, the Biden administration told Ukraine, we don't want you hitting deep into Russia. So a change in US policy, but that pressure from Ukraine has been there from the start. Please let us hit back. I think Donald Trump once mentioned you have to be offensive if you are defending. And that was the feeling in Ukraine, was not being able to strike deep into Russia means they were effectively fighting with one arm tied behind their back. So there has been that desire from Ukraine to hit Russia's war economy and its ability to finance its invasion.
Now we have a soundbite from the commander of 14th Unmanned Aerial Systems Regiment. Let's give it a listen.
We must not forget that the enemy has the most powerful air defense system on the continent. And the enemy also made a very large bet on the development of its electronic warfare and electronic means of detecting our UAVs. Nevertheless, we are identifying weak spots, analyzing every operation, and implementing new technologies based on these analyses. This enables us to complete our missions successfully, time and time again.
So we're implementing new technologies based on our analysis. Now, the question is, who's winning this arms race when it comes to high tech in the war in Ukraine?
They're both winning, they're both losing. Neither is winning, neither is losing at this stage. So we spoke about FPV drones. The Ukrainians were much quicker to develop them, to roll them out, to scale them, to use them effectively on the battlefield. That's why we've seen some Ukrainian successes. And you just heard the commander of the 14th Unmanned Aerial Systems Regiment there talking about electronic warfare. This was a big part of it because those radio signals used for these FPV drones have to be jammed if you want to stop them. This, in turn, created fiber optic drones. Same design, quadcopter, same design, except hanging underneath is a large spool, a large wheel of fiber optic cable which goes behind the drone as it flies, which means you cannot jam the radio signal. On that, the Russian side was much faster to roll it out, much faster to use it effectively, and that has been a problem for the Ukrainian side.
Maybe it had a better access to the cables.
Maybe it did, and that was
And where from?
Exactly right. Support from China has been crucial for the technological advancements in Russia. So too when it comes to missiles, the support from North Korea. When it comes to drones, Shaheds in particular, Iran was deeply involved. You know, Russia pretends, or at least claims, that this is a war from NATO against Russia, that this is a global conflict. But the only country that has brought troops into the opposing side is Russia, with North Korean troops fighting in this war as well. So clearly there's a narrative discrepancy there, but when it comes to technology, the Ukrainians are advanced on one side, the Russians do better on another. There is no silver bullet clearly in this war, despite what some analysts might want to say.
Let's then discuss missiles for a change, and we'll start with President Zelensky's soundbite.
The main topic was our capabilities for the long-range sanctions against Russia. Weapons manufacturers and all those responsible for employing these weapons took part. We reviewed the effectiveness of our long-range strikes over a defined period and the results achieved. Russian oil refining is already paying a tangible price for the war and will pay even more. we set tasks to expand the geography for the use of our long-range capabilities. We are working closely with manufacturers on long-term contracts. The 3-year term allows manufacturers to better plan the use of necessary resources and scale up supplies to the military.
So we have learned lately that Ukraine, in fact, is already using its Flamingo missiles. Can these Flamingos tip the scale of the conflict in Ukraine's favour? I'm afraid I know the answer already.
They can help, but as I said just before, no silver bullet. Flamingo will not be the thing that changes the complete course of this war, but it can make a serious impact if it performs as advertised, right? We've seen limited use of Flamingo. We don't have a lot of information. I would be very cautious to speculate too much. Now, the claim is it has a range of 1,200 kilometers. That would mean targeting deep into Russian territory, a speed of 700 kilometers per hour, and can carry a 75-kilogram warhead. That packs a real punch if it can be used, if it can evade Russian air defenses. But as we said, with these air attacks, these long-range attacks, it's a combination. We've seen the Russians do this. They'll fire 500 Shahed drones, but also a dozen, 2 dozen missiles at the same time, hoping to overwhelm the detection capabilities of Ukraine and the air defenses. The same logic applies the other way around. Now, Flamingo may be a serious asset. We do not know how it compares against Tomahawk or other Western missiles. I'm sure we'll come back to that.
Yeah, it will.
But it could help. It could make a difference. It could pack a punch. And psychologically, it could really impact people in Russia. If they hear that Ukraine has a new missile that can reach deeper into the territory than ever before, maybe even in the regions of big Russian cities. We have no evidence so far that Ukraine has targeted Russian cities or civilians specifically, but psychologically it can make a difference in the same way that the Oreshnik, the high-tech Russian missile, which months ago President Putin liked talking about, he's not talking about it quite so much anymore, used to be quite a fright in Ukraine. Flamingo could do the same in Russia.
I see. Now, the other question is, where are the missiles launched from, right? And I guess Russia has much bigger fleet of its aircraft to use. I don't know whether Oreshnik are launched from underneath the aircraft. Yes? Yep. Okay. So that's the case. And Ukraine also needs to have many warplanes to, well, at least to try to attack Russia deep behind enemy lines. Now, 250 warplanes. That's President Zelensky's plan. Is this enough to stop Russia?
He thinks so. If that's his plan, I would suspect he actually aimed a little bit high on that number because he wants to encourage as much support as possible for his country. Crucially for the Ukrainian side, deep strikes, of course, planes are a part of this, but planes are extremely expensive and can be shot down. And so the big role, for example, of F-16s, which was a huge priority for the Ukrainians, and now I think they're receiving a few more from Belgium. The Dutch have sent some F-16s. They have some Mirage 2000s from France as well. Their key role is in air defense, stopping cruise missiles in midair. That's where fighter jets have really come into their own in this conflict. We have not seen the kind of World War II style dogfighting in the skies above Ukraine, which has been a really interesting development. There has not been complete air superiority from either side. In fact, you could look at this and say Russia has not been able to have any air dominance as you would have expected it to do at the beginning. So a fleet of 250 new aircraft obviously would make Ukraine a very sizable air force in that region and a real deterrence to Russia. Of course, that will be a concern for Russia because it could also be used in an offensive capacity. Is it enough? It'll depend on how the Russian Air Force develops, how this war moves forward or changes, or if a ceasefire is, we hope, reached. So it's clearly a big force. Clearly, President Zelensky thinks it's important. It's important for offensive capabilities, for air defense. We'll just have to see how much can be produced and how much will be delivered to Ukraine.
Right. Now, Russia is constantly pounding Ukraine's military production sites. As you said, with these swarms of drones, they are not all designed to hit residential areas. Some of them are also meant to disable Ukraine's arms production. Therefore, my question, should Ukrainian weapons be produced rather domestically or outside of Ukraine?
Well, the focus for Ukraine is to produce domestically. For logistics reasons, it is clearly easier to get things where they need to be if you have them close to the front line. And you may not know it on a map, but having driven through the country a couple of times, it's pretty big. It takes a long time to get things across. The railways, as we know, have been targeted, but they're also quite saturated. The Ukrainian railways are carrying people, logistics, freight, military things. So the closer the better, but as you said, closer, higher risk. There's also questions if you're producing weapons in other countries, if that then becomes a viable target for the Russian side. So there are a lot of questions about that. Clearly, high profile, high risk military production, much safer in NATO countries, but when it comes to logistics, easier to have it in Ukraine.
We have already touched upon the subject. Well, President Zelensky says Ukraine needs the Western support. He was actually referring to the frozen Russian assets, but he's talking about the perspective the next 2 up to 3 years of fighting, constant fighting with Russia. But what comes after that? Because the Polish Prime Minister says he's afraid of a 10-year perspective. Now, can Ukraine really withstand the pressure from Russia for the next 10 long years?
Very difficult to answer that clearly. President Zelensky has said very clearly that he does not think his country can retake the territory it has lost militarily. There is no clear momentum on the Ukrainian side to suddenly push all the forces back. Now, President Trump has said he thinks Ukraine can reclaim all its territory. The path to doing that isn't clear. But at the same token, at the same time, although the Russian forces are advancing and are taking land, the value of the land that they take is not clear strategically at the moment. At the current rate, we've heard experts say this, it would take Russia somewhere between 4 and 5 years to take the entirety of Ukraine at the rate that it's going. And that doesn't necessarily account for the losses that Russia would have to take to do that and the cost to the Russian economy, which we have heard is already struggling. So can Ukraine win? Probably not in this current situation. Will it lose? Also unlikely. So therefore, we're stuck in the middle. The determining factor from the Ukrainian perspective is how much support do they get from European partners, how much weaponry can they get from the US, how many sanctions go in to slow the Russian economy, slow its ability to finance this war, and changing the logic in Vladimir Putin's mind, making the cost of this war going so high that maybe he reconsiders his invasion of Ukraine.
And lastly, as you have rightly said, we will talk about Tomahawks. You said that these aerial attacks are combined attacks, right? There's always a swarm of drones and few long-range missiles. So will Ukraine finally receive the famed Tomahawks from Donald Trump?
Another question that's impossible to answer with any certainty. President Trump has said he had made a decision. He just wants to know how they're being used. And then he, after a phone call with Vladimir Putin, said that he hopes that the war can end without the Tomahawk missiles. And that position is changing somewhat. There are some questions beyond the mind of Donald Trump about Tomahawks, which I feel maybe skew the debate a little bit when it comes to these missiles. We don't know if Ukraine has the capacity to launch them at the moment. They're usually launched from submarines or destroyers or very sophisticated naval ships that Ukraine does not have. How they launch them remains a question. Where they launch them, of course, remains a question. There's also a cost perspective. Tomahawks are an older class of missile. They're very expensive. They are huge. They're about the size of an articulated truck. So they're big, big, big pieces of kit. So there are still some questions. Whether or not, if they were delivered tomorrow, Ukraine could launch them, still uncertain, almost as uncertain as the mind of Donald Trump.
And I guess we should put a full stop here. Alex Cadier, TVP World's EU and Ukraine correspondent. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you.
I think we have covered a lot when it comes to aerial warfare in Ukraine. Thank you for watching and stay with us for more interviews here on TVP World.